The marble streets of Rome once echoed with power. The clang of armor, the roar of victory, the cheers of citizens celebrating another conquest. But beneath those triumphs, something darker stirred. By the time Gaius Caesar, better known as Caligula, seized the imperial throne, Rome had already begun to rot from within. The Senate whispered, the soldiers feared, and the gods, it seemed, had gone silent. Then one morning the city awoke to find that its emperor had changed. Not in title, not in crown, but in soul. The man who once smiled like a child of destiny now stared at the world with eyes hollowed by madness. His laughter filled the palace halls, and not from joy but from something deeper, and much more dangerous. The streets would soon run with the blood of senators and slaves alike. Lovers were executed for amusement. Families vanished overnight. The once golden empire became a theater of humiliation and cruelty. The people called him Caligula the Mad. But madness alone can't explain what happened next. Because his reign wasn't just an accident of insanity. It was a deliberate unraveling of Rome's moral order. A public spectacle of how absolute power can erode the soul until only the cruelty remains. In just 4 years, he turned the empire of law into a circus of terror. He made the gods of Rome his puppets, and he taught his people a lesson they would never forget, that the worst monster is not born in darkness. It is crowned in daylight. Because when Caligula looked upon his empire, he didn't see citizens or soldiers. He saw an audience, and what followed was his performance. Long before the screams echoed through marble corridors, there was a child named Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, born into a dynasty drenched in power and blood. His father, Germanicus, was Rome's golden general, beloved by the people, adored by the legions. His mother, Agrippina, was descended from emperors, and his great-uncle was Augustus, the man who turned the Roman Republic into an empire. From birth, Caligula was raised in palaces shadowed by paranoia. The Roman elite smiled in public, but behind those smiles were daggers. Treachery was a family tradition, and every meal could be a trap. When his father died under mysterious circumstances, some said poisoned by the jealous Emperor Tiberius, the boy learned an early truth. In Rome, love was just another weapon. As a child, Caligula was adored by the soldiers of his father's army. They nicknamed him Caligula, meaning little boots, for the tiny soldier's sandals he wore while marching beside them. He was their mascot, innocent, harmless, adored. But innocence doesn't survive long in the palaces of Rome. When Tiberius took him in, the emperor's villa became his prison. Caligula learned to smile through horror, to laugh while others were executed, to praise the emperor who had destroyed his family. He became a master of pretense, masking his hatred behind charm, his trauma behind wit. By the time he inherited the throne in 37 AD, Rome was desperate for hope. The Senate cheered his name. The people threw flowers at his chariot. They called him the savior of Rome. For a brief moment, it seemed true. He abolished cruel taxes, freed prisoners, restored forgotten honors. But inside that fragile peace, something twisted was growing. Because years of fear had done something terrible to Caligula. They had turned compassion into contempt. The boy who once played in his father's camps had returned as emperor, but he didn't come back to serve Rome. He came to punish it. And in the months that followed, the empire would realize that the child they once adored had grown into something unrecognizable. A ruler who believed he was not merely a man, but a god. Power doesn't corrupt all at once. It seeps in quietly, like poison in wine. And for Caligula, that poison began to take hold not long after he ascended the throne. At first, there were whispers of illness. He fell gravely sick only months into his reign, feverish, hallucinating, near death. The empire prayed for his recovery. Temples overflowed with offerings, and then he lived. But the man who rose from that bed was not the same man who had collapsed into it. Something had changed behind his eyes. The warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, glittering amusement. He began speaking of the gods, not as distant beings to be worshipped, but as rivals to be mocked. He demanded temples to his own name, statues of his image in every shrine. He even ordered priests to replace the heads of Jupiter's statues with his own. Rome had crowned an emperor. What it got was a self-proclaimed god. The line between theater and reality started to dissolve. Banquets became nightmares of excess. Guests were forced to eat and drink until they vomited, and those who refused were executed for disrespect. He ordered his soldiers to collect seashells from the shore, declaring them the spoils of war from a victory over the sea god Neptune. When the crowd laughed, he smiled, not with humor but with hunger. Every gesture of loyalty became a test. Every praise a trap. Senators who once bowed too low were accused of mockery. Nobles who stayed silent were accused of conspiracy. Even his sisters, once adored, became victims of his suspicion, imprisoned or exiled after false accusations of betrayal. The palace turned into a labyrinth of paranoia. Servants learned to walk without making noise. Guards whispered before drawing breath. Those who served Caligula longest learned a simple truth. His moods shifted like storms, and survival depended on predicting them. He began hosting nightly performances, macabre spectacles where prisoners were torn apart for amusement. Sometimes he would step into the arena himself, dressed as a gladiator drenched in gold and blood. He called it divine justice. The crowd called it madness, but Caligula didn't see madness. He saw obedience. He saw fear. And to him, fear was proof that he was right, that he truly was something more than mortal. Rome watched as the man they had once celebrated transformed into its executioner. He had conquered not through armies but through the human mind, through terror so absolute that even silence became a form of worship. By the 3rd year of his reign, the empire no longer belonged to Rome. It belonged to one man's delusion, and that delusion had a crown. By the 4th year of Caligula's reign, the emperor no longer ruled Rome. He ruled reality itself. Every corner of the empire reflected his delusion. The Senate chambers had become his stage, and the empire's wealth was drained not by war but by spectacle. Caligula believed himself immortal, the living incarnation of a god among insects. He spoke of conversations with Jupiter. He demanded sacrifices in his own name. He ordered bridges of marble to be built across the Bay of Baiae so he could ride his horse Incitatus across the sea like a god. To mock the Senate, he appointed that very horse as a priest. He even promised to make it consul of Rome, the highest office beneath the emperor himself. The gesture wasn't madness for its own sake. It was humiliation, weaponized in a message to every noble, every senator, every man who had once believed in Rome's dignity. The empire had become a mirror of one man's ego, and then came the darkest spectacle of all. During a grand feast, Caligula invited hundreds of Rome's elite to dine in the palace garden. Golden lamps illuminated the marble courtyard. Perfumed fountains filled the air with sweetness. Then, as the guests laughed and drank, Caligula turned to them with a smile and said, "Tonight the gods dine with mortals." Moments later, his guards surrounded the table. He ordered the executions of those seated closest to him, senators, poets, lovers, their throats cut before the wine stopped spilling. He watched in silence, sipping calmly from his cup as if death were simply part of the evening's entertainment. When asked why, he answered coldly, "If I had the power, I would strike the world with lightning and let no one live." That was his truth, the hidden revelation at the core of his madness. Caligula didn't just believe he was a god. He believed that divinity meant cruelty, that the power to destroy was the truest form of creation. To him, mercy was weakness. Sympathy was treason. Life itself was theater, and Rome was his audience. Historians would later call it psychosis. Others would call it vengeance against a world that had broken him as a child. But the result was the same. An emperor who stood between genius and insanity, unable to tell the difference anymore. And as his paranoia deepened, one final delusion consumed him. He began to believe the gods envied him. That belief would seal his fate and bring the most powerful empire on earth to the brink of implosion. By the time Caligula's delusions reached their peak, Rome itself had begun to fracture. The Senate, once the symbol of order and intellect, had become a hollow assembly of frightened men. They praised him to his face, cursed him in whispers, and prayed that the gods he mocked would somehow end what they could not. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite protectors, no longer knew where loyalty ended and survival began. Every command felt like a death sentence, every glance a test. In the streets, The citizens who once shouted his name now watched in silence as corpses of nobles, slaves, and innocents alike were dragged through the mud. Rome, the eternal city, had become a carnival of fear. The economy collapsed under the weight of Caligula's extravagance. Treasuries were emptied to fund gold-plated ships, jeweled banquets, and colossal statues of himself towering above temples once dedicated to the gods. He forced senators to surrender their wealth to feed his theatrical appetites, then mocked their obedience by demanding more. But the deeper consequence wasn't financial. It was moral. Rome had been built on discipline, on the illusion of reason guiding power. Caligula shattered that illusion. He proved that law, tradition, and religion were fragile constructs, easily destroyed by a man who simply stopped believing in them. The empire's philosophers wrote in fear, its generals hesitated to act, and its citizens learned a new rule of survival. Obedience meant nothing if madness ruled the throne, and yet, even as Rome decayed, there was something disturbingly magnetic about him. People couldn't look away. His cruelty became legend, his unpredictability myth. It was as if the entire empire had become addicted to its own nightmare, unable to stop watching even as it burned. But all tyrannies end the same way, not with rebellion, but with silence. And soon that silence began to move within the marble halls of his own palace. Whispers turned to plans. Plans turned to daggers. Even gods, it seemed, could bleed. It happened quietly, far quieter than the chaos that had defined his life. No roaring crowd, no burning temples, just the echo of footsteps in a marble corridor, and the faint tremor of fear in the air. In January of 41 AD, Caligula entered a private theater attached to his palace. He was surrounded by his guards, his wife Caesonia, and a handful of attendants. It was an ordinary day, or at least it seemed to be. But among those guards were men who had grown tired of worshipping a god made of flesh. As the emperor turned his back, the first blade struck. Then another, and another. Witnesses said he fell without a sound, eyes wide, more in disbelief than pain. The man who had demanded the world kneel before him died not with thunder, but with whispers. His blood ran across the marble tiles, reflecting the same golden lamplight that once illuminated his feasts of terror. His wife was murdered beside him. His infant daughter's cries were silenced soon after. The divine emperor was gone, erased not by fate but by the very fear he had created. When the Senate heard of his death, there was no mourning. Only relief. Rome exhaled for the first time in years, yet even in death, Caligula's shadow didn't vanish. His reign left scars, on the empire, on its laws, and on the minds of those who survived him. Because his story wasn't just about insanity, it was about what happens when humanity forgets its limits, when power becomes its own religion. And somewhere, in the silent chambers of history, his laughter still echoes. A reminder that the worst monsters are not born in darkness, they're created in daylight. Rome buried Caligula's body in haste, without ceremony, without name. They tried to erase him, to silence what he had become. But the memory of a man who believed himself divine cannot be buried so easily, because his madness wasn't unique. It was a mirror, a reflection of what happens when fear becomes loyalty and obedience becomes worship. Every empire has its Caligula, and every age convinces itself that it could never happen again. But history whispers otherwise. Power still tempts, control still corrupts, and somewhere in the hearts of those who believe they can't be questioned, his legacy still breathes. So the question isn't why Caligula went mad. The question is, how close are we to becoming him again? What do you think? Was Caligula a victim of madness, or the perfect reflection of humanity's thirst for power?